In the desolate Arizona mountains, where the reclusive Colton Blake sought oblivion, he stumbled upon a gruesome sight: a young woman, hanged and branded as an Apache lover. Behind this brutal injustice stood a greedy sheriff and a judge who used fear and lies to dispose of those who opposed them. But they didn't know that the woman held a secret that could bring down their entire criminal empire, and in Colton, they faced a man who was tired of injustice and willing to fight to the end. And this story is a vivid testament that even the most powerful villains cannot escape retribution. Subscribe and like, because the story's climax, where the truth comes out, is truly worth watching until the end. Colton Blake, a recluse and former soldier, lived on the outskirts, preferring the company of his own thoughts and the wild nature of Arizona to the hustle and bustle of people. His home, a humble cabin at the foot of Crimson Ridge, was his fortress and his prison. He arrived here 10 years ago, after the war had taken everything from him except scars and phantom pain. Colton was a man of few words. His face, carved with wrinkles and scorched by the sun, rarely expressed anything but a grim detachment. His only companion was a horse named Ghost, as loyal and silent as his owner. In the morning, as the sun began to paint the sky in peach and orange hues, Colton headed towards the canyon where his small mine was located. He had no ambitions of getting rich. He just needed to keep his hands and mind busy to avoid thinking about the past. That day, he deviated from his usual route to check if any drifter had broken his snares for rabbits. Suddenly, amidst the familiar scenery, his gaze caught on something foreign. On a branch of a mighty oak that grew near an old abandoned shack, something was hanging, swaying in the faint wind. Ghost neighed, sensing his master's distress, and Colton, spurring his horse, rushed forward. His heart clenched with a premonition of disaster. As he approached, he saw something that made him freeze in the saddle. On a rope slung over a thick branch, a young woman was hanging. Her light hair was scattered across her face, and her skin, which seemed like porcelain, was covered in bruises and dirt. Her clothes, a simple calico dress, were torn. Her hands were tied behind her back, and a brand darkened her forehead. Upon closer inspection, he could make out the words burned with a hot iron: Apache Lover. It was a brand of shame, a verdict passed by white settlers in their own form of justice on those who, in their opinion, had betrayed their race by consorting with Indians. Colton dismounted. His fingers, accustomed to a weapon, trembled. She was still alive. Her lungs rattled, trying to draw breath, but the rope was pulled too tight. He instantly pulled out his knife and cut her down, catching her falling body.
I ask you to like and subscribe to the channel, so you will help me in motivation to make such great stories for you, and I will see that you like them. Enjoy watching, everyone.
It was light and fragile, almost weightless. He carried her to his cabin, laid her on the hard bed, and carefully examined her. The brand on her forehead, that was the most brutal and noticeable scar, but there were others on her body, signs of beatings and humiliation. He carefully washed her wounds and gave her water. Her eyes, gray blue like the pre-dawn sky, slowly opened. They held not fear or pain, but a deep, endless exhaustion. She didn't say a word, only looked at him with a long, scrutinizing gaze, as if trying to understand who he was and why he had saved her. Colton, in turn, did not ask any questions. He knew that in these parts, any story, especially one like this, has two sides, and judging by her appearance, she had already suffered enough from judges who had not bothered to listen to her. He promised himself that he would not be the second person to judge her. His motivation was simple. He saw in her not a traitorous woman, but a victim who had fallen into the clutches of cruel people. He himself was a victim of war, and this feeling was familiar to him. He wanted to give her a chance that many others in a similar situation didn't have. He offered her clothes and food, and while she slept, he decided to go to the nearest town to find out what had happened. This town was a center of injustice that had taken the lives of innocent people in the past, and he knew it. Therefore, his anger was directed at the entire system that had created this situation, not just at specific people. He didn't just want to save the woman, he wanted to punish those who did this, to restore a sense of justice. But as he later learned, this was just the beginning. His journey to the town, called Western Cross, turned out to be more dangerous than he had anticipated. In the town, everything was quiet, too quiet. People looked at him with suspicion, and he immediately understood that something was wrong here. His inquiries about recent events were met with a wall of silence. He entered a saloon, where two men were sitting at a table, playing cards. Colton walked up to them and offered to buy them a drink. During the conversation, he casually mentioned the woman he had found. The men, named Jacob and Sam, initially tensed up, but then, apparently deciding he was not a threat, began to talk. They told him that this woman, Mary, was the wife of one of the best hunters in town, who had disappeared a few weeks ago. The locals, without much thought, accused her of running away with an Apache Indian and killing her husband to cover her tracks. "She's certainly not the only one. There are many of us like her here. They just caught her," Jacob whispered, nervously glancing around. They talked about how the town's elite, led by the judge and the sheriff, used the fear of the Apaches to consolidate their power and eliminate dissidents. They had created this atmosphere where anyone who didn't fit in became an enemy. Returning home, Colton found Mary awake. She was sitting by the fire, wrapped in a blanket. He told her what he had learned. Her face remained expressionless, but her eyes filled with cold, silent pain. They killed him," she whispered, and Colton understood she was talking about her husband. It was not betrayal, but a brutal murder that they had tried to cover up. Colton saw that her compassion for her husband, her pain from the loss, and her anger at the injustice united them. He promised her that he would help find the killers and restore justice, because for him, this had become not just a matter of honor, but a return of meaning to his life. He, a man who had fled from the past, found in this woman a reason to fight again. The morning in Colton Blake's cabin was filled with anxious anticipation. Mary, now dressed in a simple men's shirt and worn-out trousers that Colton had found for her, sat by the hearth, staring at the fire, which seemed to be the only source of warmth in her devastated life. Colton was making breakfast, his movements slow and methodical, like a man accustomed to the routine of solitude. He watched her furtively, trying to decipher the silent sadness that was frozen in her eyes. He saw in her not just a victim, but a woman from whom a part of her soul had been torn, and it was excruciatingly compassionate for him, who had survived his own losses, to watch. After breakfast, when the sun had already risen over the mountains, Mary decided to speak. Her voice was quiet and hoarse, as if she hadn't used it for many days. She said that her husband, John, was not just a hunter, but a geologist who had discovered a rich gold deposit in the mountains. He had kept it a secret, fearing that a gold rush would destroy their peaceful life. But his discovery had somehow become known to Sheriff Henderson and Judge Griffin. They had offered him a deal, sell them the land for a pittance, but John had refused. He was too honest, Mary whispered, and the tears she had held back for so long finally streamed down her cheeks. She recounted how they had been attacked by masked men, how her husband had been killed, and she herself kidnapped to stage a shameful escape with the Apaches. The last thing she saw was the sneering face of the sheriff, who himself had branded her forehead. This confession filled Colton with burning anger, not just at injustice, but at specific people, at their calculated cruelty. He saw how the system he had once served was once again showing its ugly face, and this strengthened his resolve. He realized they couldn't stay in the cabin. The sheriff and his henchmen wouldn't stop searching until they were sure Mary was dead. Colton packed supplies, saddled Ghost, and told Mary to get on. They set off on mountain trails known only to him. The next few days were a test. They rode through rugged terrain, avoiding open roads, sleeping under the stars, and eating hardtack. Mary, although exhausted, held on with surprising resilience. She helped him with chores, lit the fire, and despite all the horror she had endured, a new determination began to appear in her eyes. Colton saw how she was transforming from a confused victim into a strong woman ready to fight. During this time, a bond began to form between them, based on shared misfortune and mutual respect. One night, by the fire, Mary pulled a small, worn leather pouch from her bosom. "This is John's," she said. Inside was an old, yellowed parchment map. It was drawn by hand and marked the location of the gold vein, with encrypted notes next to it. Obviously, John hadn't trusted anyone, which is why he used a cipher. Mary explained that John had shown her the map a few days before his death, and she had managed to hide it. Now that she was safe, it became their only trump card. She hoped that this map would help them expose the sheriff and the judge. Colton carefully studied the map. As a former military man, he immediately realized that the cipher was not just a set of symbols. It was an old army cipher that he knew. It took several hours to decipher, and when he finished, he realized that the map not only pointed to the location of the gold, but also contained the names of those who were helping the sheriff and the judge. The list included a local merchant, a saloon owner, and even one of the members of the city council. And most importantly, it indicated that their conspiracy was aimed at seizing not only this specific land, but also other plots belonging to small farmers under the guise of fighting the Apaches. This was much more than just the murder of one man. It was a large-scale conspiracy that could lead to the destruction of an entire community. The shock of the scale of their cruelty and greed was strong, and Colton realized that they would have to act cautiously and cleverly. He was ready for a fight, but against such an organization, he needed a plan. He looked at Mary, her eyes burned with a determination that was reflected in his own. They decided they needed to return to Western Cross, not to hide, but to find allies and gather evidence. They developed a plan. Mary, disguised, was to infiltrate the town and contact those who were unhappy with the sheriff's authority, while Colton would remain in the shadows, gathering information and preparing for the final showdown. It was a very dangerous step, but they knew there was no other way. Their hope was that they would find people willing to risk everything to restore justice. Colton and Mary approached Western Cross under the cover of night. Their plan was risky and required extreme caution. Colton left Ghost at a safe distance from the town, in a rock crevice, and together with Mary, wrapped in a dark cloak, they made their way through the deserted outskirts. Mary, with her light hair, was too noticeable, so Colton cut her hair and dyed it with berry ink. It was a desperate measure, but it had to work to make her unrecognizable. They separated at an old barn on the edge of town. Mary's task was to find the people mentioned in the list that Colton had deciphered and try to enlist their support. Her first target was the saloon owner, old and disgruntled Grayson. Colton, in turn, was to watch Sheriff Henderson and Judge Griffin, gathering information and looking for their weak spots. But his real anger was directed at the entire system that allowed such people to commit tyranny. Mary, hiding in the shadows, slipped into town. Western Cross was small, and rumors spread like wildfire. She overheard two miners in the bar discussing the recent murder of a man who, according to them, was also against the sheriff's authority. Their conversation quickly turned to John. They were sure he couldn't have run away with the Apaches, and that there was something else behind his death. Mary realized that there were disgruntled people in the town, and this was her advantage. She discreetly approached Grayson, the saloon owner, and using a code word that Colton had devised from the Army cipher, she got his attention. Grayson, an old Civil War veteran, recognized the cipher and immediately understood that the person in front of him was someone he could trust. She introduced herself as John's sister, and Grayson, who himself hated the sheriff and his cronies, agreed to help. At the same time, Colton, watching Judge Griffin's house, noticed that Sheriff Henderson had come to him. He overheard them discussing recent events, including John's murder. Griffin was unhappy that Colton had not been found. He was afraid that Colton, who was a well-known recluse, might know too much and become a threat to their plans. The sheriff assured him that Colton was not a danger, but the judge was adamant. He demanded that Henderson not only find, but also eliminate Colton, and if he didn't, he would have to answer to him and the other members of the conspiracy. Colton realized that he had become a target, and that he had no choice but to act. The next day, Mary gathered a small circle of like-minded people who had also suffered from the arbitrariness of the sheriff and the judge. Among them was an old veteran who had lost his land, a young woman whose father had mysteriously disappeared, and one of the miners who had been unfairly accused of theft. Their hope was that they would be able to gather enough evidence to stand against the sheriff and the judge at the town meeting, which was to take place in a few days. They began to collect testimonies, look for documents, and write down everything they could find. Colton, meanwhile, was tracking the sheriff. He knew that the sheriff, like any corrupt official, must have a place where he kept his dark secrets. And he was right. He found a secret safe in the sheriff's office, which contained forged documents, testimonies that had been fabricated against undesirable people, and, most importantly, a list of everyone involved in the conspiracy and how much they had been paid. This was exactly what they needed. It was the culmination of their investigation, the moment when all their efforts finally began to bear fruit. They had irrefutable evidence that could expose not only the sheriff and the judge, but also everyone who stood behind them. However, in the midst of it all, Colton noticed that he was being followed. He got into a fight with one of the sheriff's henchmen, who managed to wound him. He managed to escape, but this warning made him realize that the sheriff knew of his presence in the town, and that they were running out of time. He realized they had to act fast before the sheriff destroyed all the evidence and found Mary. He returned to the barn, where Mary was waiting for him, and told her about his discovery and that he was wounded. Mary, though scared, gave him first aid and promised they would manage. This was the beginning of their triumph, but they still had to pay a high price for it. A small group of allies gathered around Grayson, found the wounded Colton and Mary. The old tavern owner, seeing the blood on the former soldier's hand, immediately provided first aid, and the others, realizing the seriousness of the situation, hid them in a secret cellar under the saloon. Colton gave them the list and the forged documents he had stolen from the sheriff's safe and explained that time was running out. While he was recovering, Mary, her voice firm despite her fear, spoke to each person in the group, inspiring them. "John believed in justice," she said. "He died defending his land and his family. We must finish what he started." At that moment, when they were at the peak of hope, the old saloon was shaken by a crash. Sheriff Henderson, with a group of his men, burst inside. He knew that Colton was somewhere nearby. His gaze slid over the faces of those present, and he sensed that a rebellion was hidden behind this facade of calm. Grayson, trying to look unperturbed, met him. "What do you want, Henderson? Come in. Let's have a drink." "I don't need your swill, Grayson," the sheriff snarled. "I know you're hiding a fugitive here. Hand him over, or we'll turn your whole barn upside down." At that moment, one of the sheriff's henchmen noticed a fresh blood trail on the floor leading to the cellar hatch. Grayson tried to distract him, but it was too late. The sheriff, smirking, shot the lock and went down. Colton, Mary, and the others were ready. This was the moment that would either be their triumph or their complete failure. As Henderson was going down the stairs, a burning lamp was thrown at him. He recoiled, and at that moment, Colton, the wounded, jumped out from around the corner and hit him on the head. A fight broke out. It was a battle not only for their lives, but for justice, for John's memory. Each person in the group fought with the fury of desperation, knowing that if they lost, they would face the same fate as Mary. When the fight was over, the sheriff and his men lay on the floor, beaten but alive. Colton and Mary's allies, having gathered all the evidence, tied them up and dragged them to the town's central square, where townspeople had already gathered. Grayson, standing on an impromptu platform, began to read aloud the testimonies and documents they had found in the sheriff's safe. He spoke of how the sheriff and the judge had bribed people, forged documents, and killed those who didn't obey them. Each new revelation sparked anger and indignation among the people. The people shouted, demanding retribution, and when Grayson finished, he handed the floor to Mary. She stood before the crowd, her face covered in dirt and tears, but her gaze was firm. She lifted her hair, showing everyone the brand on her forehead. "This is a brand of shame," she said. "A brand that Sheriff Henderson burned on me because I loved my husband and he wanted to seize our land. He killed my husband and disgraced my name. But I am not a traitor. I am a victim, and there are many like me in this town. We must put an end to this." Her words, as well as the evidence presented by Grayson, finally broke the will of the people. They descended upon the sheriff and the judge, who tried to justify themselves, but no one listened. In the end, their fate was decided not by law and court, but by mob justice, which was as cruel as their own actions. Colton and Mary did not participate in this. They simply watched as justice, albeit in such a crude form, triumphed. A few days later, when the passions had subsided, Colton and Mary stood on the doorstep of her cabin. The town had elected a new sheriff, and life was gradually returning to normal. Mary decided to stay in town to restore her husband's farm and make sure nothing like this would happen again. She was a hero, and people respected her for her courage. Colton, though happy for her, knew that his path lay elsewhere. He said goodbye to her, but she stopped him. "Thank you, Colton," she said. "You saved not only me but this town." He nodded, smiling for the first time in a long while. He realized that although he had not found peace, he had found something more important: a purpose. He was no longer a fugitive from the past, he had become a protector of the future. Watching Henderson and Griffin get what they deserved, Mary and Colton felt not just satisfaction, but a deep sense of schadenfreude. It was not the kind of schadenfreude one feels from another's misfortune, but the kind that arises from the restoration of a broken order, from the realization that evil has finally been defeated. It was a bitter but deserved feeling. Colton realized that he could now leave, knowing that the peace he had tried to find in solitude, he had found by restoring justice.